When the galaxy declared war on Earth, it did so with laughter woven into every formal transmission, because the high Concord systems had watched humanity for decades and judged it loud, divided, slow to agree, and dependent on fragile supply chains, and the declaration itself was read aloud in a vaulted chamber where dozens of alien species gathered as if for a festival, believing they were about to witness a short and instructive punishment. And on Earth the message arrived during a quiet rotation when most of the planet slept, translated cleanly by an automated network that flagged as a Category Red existential threat. And within minutes the alert spread through buried bunkers, naval yards, research stations, and civilian leadership offices, waking people who had trained their whole lives for a moment they never believed would come. And President Laura Bennett listened to the words in silence before asking only one question: whether the enemy had finished talking, because she had learned that humans made their worst mistakes when they answered too fast. And as the reply came back confirming the declaration was complete, she nodded and authorized a response that did not threaten, did not boast, and did not reveal anything beyond a simple acknowledgement that Earth had received a message, which confused the alien council because most species responded to war with ritualized displays of strength, but humanity responded with quiet, and in the hours that followed, Earth did not mobilize fleets in open space or broadcast speeches to stir fear or pride. Instead, it closed ports, went dark across civilian networks, and shifted traffic into encrypted channels built decades earlier when a handful of human strategists had argued that any species capable of crossing stars would be watching first and striking fast. And those strategists had been mocked at the time for paranoia. Yet now their plans unfolded without ceremony as Admiral Helen Carter took command of the unified defense grid from a room without windows and without rank insignia, because she believed symbols invited assumptions, and assumptions got people killed. And she spoke to her commanders in a calm voice that did not rise even when reports came in of alien fleets forming along known approach vectors, massive formations of ships that gleamed with energy shields and ceremonial markings meant to intimidate. And on the alien side, the supreme war speaker of the Concord, a towering being, named Carix, whose species valued dominance, displays above all else, assured the Council that humanity would break within days because no species had ever survived a first contact war without fracturing along internal lines. And Earth was famous for its internal arguments, yet as the alien armadas advanced, they noticed something odd in the data streams they intercepted, because Earth traffic did not spike with panic or propaganda. It flattened, becoming sparse and deliberately boring, full of routine logistics codes and maintenance chatter that suggested confusion rather than preparation. And Carix laughed at this and ordered the first wave to accelerate, believing speed would finish the job. While on Earth, scientists named Daniel Moore stood in a lab far below the surface adjusting parameters on a system that had never been tested in combat. A system designed not to destroy ships but to blind sensors in ways that mimic cosmic noise. Because humans had learned long ago that if you could not hide your strength, you could hide your intent. And as the first alien scouts crossed into the outer solar boundary, they reported nothing unusual except the absence of resistance, which was exactly what Admiral Carter wanted. Because humans never fought fair when fair meant standing still and trading blows. And the scouts vanished not in explosions, but in silence, as their sensors filled with false readings, and their navigation systems fed them slightly wrong data that nudged them into empty space where they drifted, alive but lost. And the Concord commanders dismissed these losses as mechanical failures caused by human incompetence, reinforcing their belief that Earth was unprepared. And they pushed forward, unaware that every ship they lost without a fight taught the humans more about alien protocols and response patterns. And on Earth, the population was told very little beyond instructions to conserve energy and trust the defense forces. And while some protested and demanded transparency, most complied, because humans had lived through enough disasters to know when to listen. And in a small office overlooking a darkened city, President Bennett met with advisors who urged a show of strength, but she refused, saying that the galaxy expected humans to fight like everyone else, and that expectation was the enemy's weakness. And as the alien fleets finally reached engagement range and unleashed their opening salvo at what they believed were key defense platforms, their weapons struck empty or decoy targets that flared convincingly before fading, and confusion rippled through their ranks as return fire did not come in predictable lines, but in staggered pulses from unexpected angles, disabling propulsion here, communications there, never destroying more than necessary, because humanity's opening move was not to kill but disorient, to make the invaders doubt their own plans. And as Carrick's demanded answers from his commanders, the first reports of something worse began to arrive, because human forces were not broadcasting victory or warning. They were silent, and silence in war was a language the galaxy did not understand. And by the end of the first engagement, Earth had lost nothing of real value, while the Concord had lost confidence, though they did not yet know it, and humanity, underestimated and officially at war, had only just begun to show the galaxy why it never fought fair. As the second phase began, the Concord leadership still believed the first losses were anomalies, because no doctrine in their long history accounted for an enemy that chose confusion over destruction, and Carrick addressed the assembled admirals with a speech about discipline and overwhelming force, ordering a full push toward Earth's inner defensive perimeter, unaware that humanity had never intended to defend space in neat layers, because humans had learned from centuries of asymmetric warfare that the battlefield was wherever the enemy thought they were safe. And while alien fleets reorganized, Admiral Helen Carter authorized the activation of long-dormant assets that had been dismissed by off-world analysts as industrial debris, hundreds of old mining platforms, research satellites, and decommissioned habitats that suddenly changed orbit in ways that violated every efficiency model the Concord used. And to the aliens, this looked like panic-driven chaos. But to human tacticians, it was a living map of kill zones and sensor traps. And as Concord ships advanced, they found their communications lagging by fractions of a second, a delay so small it would be ignored in any other context. Yet in fleet maneuvers, those delays compounded into missed turns and overlapping field of fire, causing near collisions that forced commanders to slow their advance. And on Earth, Daniel Moore watched data streams, confirming his system was working not by overpowering alien technology, but by exploiting assumptions baked into it. Because alien sensors filtered out noise patterns common in their own space, but rare in the Sol region, and humans had amplified those exact patterns until reality itself looked like background interference. And as this unfolded, a human captain named Eric Lawson commanded a small task group that never appeared on Concord threat lists because its ships were old and lightly armed. Yet Lawson's orders were not to fight, but to observe and provoke, slipping into the edges of alien formations and triggering automated defenses before vanishing, teaching alien systems to react to harmless stimuli while ignoring real threats. And frustration grew among Concord crews who were trained for honor duels and decisive strikes, not an enemy that refused to present a target. And in the council chamber, Carrick dismissed concerns raised by junior analysts, stating that humanity's lack of direct engagement proved weakness. But behind closed doors, some species began to worry because their historical records showed that predators who delayed the kill were often the most dangerous. And as days passed, Earth's civilian infrastructure remained intact, not because the Concord lacked firepower, but because every strike they launched hit something that was meant to be hit, decoys seeded with just enough data to validate alien targeting algorithms. And when Concord forces finally managed to destroy what they believed was a major human command node, they broadcast the footage as proof of progress, only for humans to ignore it entirely, continuing operations without interruption, which unsettled the aliens more than any counterattack. And President Laura Bennett received briefings showing public morale holding steady despite limited information, because humans sense instinctively that something was working, and she authorized a limited message to the world stating simply that the situation was under control and that restraint was part of the plan. And restraint was a word the galaxy never associated with humanity, because historical observation had focused on human brutality when cornered, not their patience. And as Concord logistics ships began to report shortages caused by unexpected fuel consumption from constant course corrections, human cyber units quietly mapped alien supply chains, not to destroy them yet, but to understand which links would break first. And Admiral Carter reminded her staff that humans never fought fair meant they never fought where the enemy was strongest. And while the Concord prepared a massive concentrated assault, believing brute force would end embarrassment, humanity prepared to turn the war into something the galaxy had never faced before, a conflict where victory was not measured in planets taken or fleets destroyed, but in the slow collapse of an invading force that could no longer trust its own eyes, instruments, or allies. And as the Concord fleets massed for what they believed would be the decisive blow, humanity watched, waited, and smiled without anyone seeing it. The third phase opened with the Concord launching its long-prepared decisive assault, a surge of coordinated fleets converging on Earth's inner system with weapons charged and confidence restored by sheer numbers, because the galaxy had always believed that mass solved uncertainty, and Carrick's personally authorized the operation, declaring that humanity would be crushed by inevitability itself. Yet as the armadas moved, they encountered resistance that did not behave like resistance, because human defenses did not concentrate where the Concord expected. Instead, pressure appeared along the flanks, behind the advance, and even within supposedly secured zones, as human drones masquerading as debris slipped through formation gaps and attached themselves to alien hulls, not to explode but to listen, feeding real-time data back to Earth. And Admiral Helen Carter studied those feeds with quiet focus, issuing orders that seemed contradictory to alien observers, pulling back forces that appeared to be winning and pushing forward units that looked exposed, because human command doctrine valued future position over present advantage. And on the ground, Daniel Moore's team pushed their interference systems further, introducing subtle variations that caused alien sensor crews to argue among themselves about what was real, eroding trust between organic judgment and machine output. And that erosion mattered more than any destroyed ship, because Concord doctrine relied on absolute confidence in hierarchical command, and doubt slowed decisions, and slowed decisions killed fleets. And as the alien advance reached what they believed was the final defensive ring, they unleashed a barrage powerful enough to crack moons, only to discover that the ring was empty, a ghost structure maintained just long enough to draw fire. And when the weapons discharged, the resulting energy blooms blinded their own sensors for critical seconds. Seconds humans had calculated down to the fraction. And into that blindness slipped human strike groups that targeted not warships but command relays, fuel depots, and repair vessels, leaving frontline ships intact but unsupported, and panic spread not as screaming, but as procedural failure, because alien captains found themselves unable to confirm orders, and in that vacuum some acted independently, breaking formation in ways that exposed them to further disruption. And Carrick's voice echoed across the command network demanding cohesion, but his words arrived delayed and distorted, stripped of authority by the very systems meant to amplify them. And on Earth, President Laura Bennett watched reports showing alien ships drifting powerless yet largely undamaged, a sight that troubled some advisors who wanted visible destruction. But she understood the strategy, because humanity was not trying to win today's battle alone. It was rewriting how the galaxy understood war, and rewriting in a way that favored those willing to accept discomfort, ambiguity, and moral restraint. And as alien casualties mounted without the expected explosions, rumors spread among Concord crews that humans were manipulating reality itself, a superstition born from fear. Yet fear is contagious regardless of its source. And in a captured transmission, an alien officer asked why the humans were not finishing them, to which another replied that predators sometimes played with prey they feared, and that fear cut deeper than any weapon. And as the Concord's assault stalled, their logistics finally buckled under the strain of constant maneuvering and failed coordination, leaving whole sectors without fuel or ammunition. And humanity seized that moment not with annihilation, but with communication, transmitting a simple message on an open channel stating that Earth had no interest in extermination, and that withdrawal corridors would remain open for those who disengaged. A message that split the Concord politically, because some species saw it as mercy while others saw it as humiliation. And Carrick rejected it outright, ordering continued advance to preserve honor. Yet honor did not refill tanks or restore trust. And as more fleets quietly withdrew despite orders, humanity achieved something the galaxy had never seen, a military victory measured not in conquered territory, but in a fractured alliance. And as the third phase ended, the Concord was still fighting, but no longer together. And humanity had proven that unfair fighting did not mean cruelty. It meant choosing rules the enemy could not survive. By the fourth phase, the war had shifted from open confrontation to a grinding psychological collapse that the Concord had no language to describe, because their doctrines did not separate morale from machinery, and humanity attacked both with equal precision, and as fractured alien fleets limped or retreated, Admiral Helen Carter ordered a controlled escalation that revealed just enough human capability to deepen fear without provoking unity. And that balance was deliberate, because every shared threat pushed the Concord toward cohesion, while every uncertain loss drove species to look inward. And across the inner system, human forces began appearing openly for first time, not as overwhelming armadas, but as calm, while space patrols that move with confidence through zones once dominated by alien power. And Concord observers reported that these human ships did not behave like victors. They did not pursue fleeing enemies aggressively. They did not taunt or broadcast dominance. They simply occupied space as if it had always belonged to them. And that quiet claim unsettled the aliens more than any victory parade. And Carrick struggled to maintain authority as more member species questioned decisions, because losses were mounting without clear enemy engagement. And worse, the humans were shaping the narrative. And on dozens of neutral channels, analysts began to ask how a supposedly inferior species had turned the Galactic Coalition into a disorganized mass in a matter of weeks. And those questions eroded political support back home. Because Concord citizens saw fleets returning damaged but not destroyed, crews shaken and uncertain, telling stories of battles they could not explain. And on Earth, Daniel Moore's systems reached a new stage as his team deliberately reduced interference in certain sectors, allowing alien sensors to briefly function correctly before flooding them again, a tactic designed to create hope followed by frustration. And humans understood from their own history that nothing broke resolve faster than thinking a problem was solved only to watch it return worse than before. And in one pivotal encounter, a Concord task force finally cornered a human battle group near a gas giant, believing they had forced a fair fight they wanted. And alien commanders prepared a textbook engagement, only for the human ships to scatter in seemingly random directions, drawing the Concord ships into pursuit paths that stretched there, formation thin. And when the aliens committed fully, the human ships vanished from sensors entirely, not through cloaking but by aligning themselves with natural radiation patterns from the gas giant, something alien engineers had never considered because their technology had evolved in calmer stellar environments. And moments later, the Concord ships lost maneuvering control as their systems shut down in response to contradictory sensor data, leaving them adrift while human boarding teams disabled key systems and departed without casualties, leaving the ships intact but helpless. And those crews were later recovered under truce corridors, carrying stories back to Concord that humans fought like ghosts who knew the terrain better than its owners. And President Laura Bennett authorized a broader diplomatic message to neutral systems emphasizing that Earth's war was defensive and limited, framing humanity not as conquerors but as reluctant enforcers of boundaries. And that framing mattered because several Concord species began to quietly open communication channels seeking separate peace terms, something unthinkable at the war's outset. And Carrick responded by ordering punitive actions against withdrawing fleets, a decision that shattered any remaining unity as species refused to sacrifice their people for wounded pride. And as internal conflicts flared within the Concord, humanity stepped back again, refusing to exploit those fractures directly, allowing alien politics to do the work instead. And Admiral Carter summarized the situation to her staff by saying the enemy was now fighting itself, while humans merely ensured it had the space to do so. And as the fourth phase closed, the galaxy began to understand a terrifying truth, that humanity's unfairness lay not in overwhelming force, but in the willingness to win without needing the enemy to lose everything at once. And that kind of victory was far harder to resist. As the conflict entered its fifth phase, the Concord was no longer a unified invader, but a wounded political entity unraveling under the weight of its own contradictions. And humanity understood that this moment was more dangerous than the opening assault because desperate powers often chose reckless escalation, and Admiral Helen Carter adjusted strategy accordingly, shifting human operations from disruption to containment, not to crush what remained the enemy, but to prevent any single faction from lashing out with catastrophic force. And that restraint confused alien observers who expected humans to press their advantage. Yet humans had learned through painful history that victory without control bred future wars. And across the contested regions, human ships established what they called stability zones, corridors where navigation was clear, communications functioned normally, and violence was actively discouraged, creating islands of calm in a war-torn expanse. And alien civilian traffic quickly gravitated toward these zones, spreading stories that human-controlled space was safer than Concord space, a narrative disaster for Carrick, who now faced open dissent within the Council. And in a tense emergency session, several species accused him of provoking a war based on flawed assumptions about humanity. And when he responded with threats of punishment, his authority finally collapsed as fleets refused direct orders, fracturing the Concord command structure beyond repair. And on Earth, President Laura Bennett authorized the release of carefully curated intelligence to neutral systems, showing the sequence of Concord decisions that led to the war, framing humanity as reactive rather than aggressive. And the galaxy listened because evidence mattered more than rhetoric. And as support for the Concord evaporated, sanctions and trade restrictions followed, further straining their ability to continue the fight. And Daniel Moore's team pivoted their systems from active interference to defensive shielding, ensuring that any attempt by rogue Concord elements to deploy planet-killing weapons would fail quietly, a safety net the galaxy would never know existed. And in one final attempt to reclaim relevance, Carrick's ordered a loyalist fleet to strike a human colony world on the fringe, believing civilian casualties would force humanity into a rage that unified as enemies against them. But the attack never reached its target because human forces intercepted it far from populated space, disabling the fleet and broadcasting proof of the attempted atrocity across every open channel. And that act sealed Carrick's fate as remaining Concord species formally removed him from command, ending centralized resistance overnight. And humanity did not celebrate, because the absence of an enemy did not mean the presence of peace. And Admiral Carter redirected fleets to humanitarian assistance, escorting damaged alien ships home and helping stabilize regions left lawless by the Concord's collapse, actions that shocked the galaxy more than any battle, because humans were extending aid to those who had come to conquer them, and that behavior forced a reevaluation of every assumption held about human nature. And as new diplomatic talks began under neutral oversight, humanity insisted on transparency and shared security frameworks rather than tribute or territory, embedding their philosophy into the post-war order. And by the time the fifth phase ended, the war was effectively over. Not with a surrender ceremony or burning worlds, but with a galaxy quietly acknowledging that humans had won by refusing to play the game as it had always been played, and that the most unfair thing they had done was to prove that dominance did not require domination. The sixth phase unfolded in the uneasy silence after open war, a silence that often carried more danger than battle, because power vacuums attracted ambition, and humanity moved carefully through that silence as provisional peace talks began across dozens of systems, with Admiral Helen Carter and President Laura Bennett coordinating military restraint with diplomatic pressure, ensuring that no emerging faction could twist the aftermath into a new justification for violence. And while formal, negotiations dragged on, human intelligence units monitored former Concord territories where warlords and opportunists attempted to seize abandoned assets, stepping in quietly to neutralize threats before they could grow, never announcing these actions publicly, because humans understood that stability thrived best when it appeared natural rather than enforced. And among alien populations, stories spread of human ships arriving without warning, restoring power grids, reopening trade lanes, and then leaving without demands, creating a strange mixture of gratitude and unease, because benevolence without strings was foreign to galactic politics. And Daniel Moore was reassigned from weapons development to advisory work, helping design shared sensor standards that prevented the kind of catastrophic misinterpretation that had sparked the war, a task he accepted reluctantly, aware that transparency reduced tactical advantage, but believing that survival mattered more than dominance. And in the remnants of the Concord Council Chamber, a new interim assembly convened, stripped of ritual and grandeur, where representatives spoke plainly for the first time about fear, miscalculation, and the cost of arrogance, and humanity was invited not as a conqueror, but as a witness, a role President Bennett accepted because witnessing carried responsibility, without ownership. And during these sessions, it became clear that the galaxy was divided not between those who hated humans and those who trusted them, but between those who feared change and those who recognized its necessity, and humanity aligned quietly with the latter, offering frameworks rather than ultimatums. And yet beneath this progress, tension simmered as scattered Concord loyalists refused to accept the outcome, launching isolated attacks meant to provoke retaliation and reignite unified hatred. And each time humanity responded with measured force and public restraint, refusing to escalate, exposing the attackers as relics of failed order. And that patience drained the last fuel from extremist movements. And Admiral Carter summarized the approach by saying that the final battle was against the memory of the war itself, and memories were harder to defeat than fleets. And as months passed, the galaxy adapted to a new strategic reality where humans were neither feared tyrants nor naive peacekeepers, but something more unsettling, a species that could dismantle power structures without replacing them with chains, and that realization reshaped military academies, economic models, and political alliances across known space. And in private, Bennett admitted to Carter that this phase frightened her more than the invasion, because success now depended on consistency rather than brilliance, and consistency was harder to maintain. And as the sixth phase drew to a close, humanity stood at the center of a fragile balance, having proven once and for all that they never fought fair because fairness implied symmetry. And humans had learned that survival often required breaking symmetry so completely that the fight itself lost meaning. The seventh phase emerged not from strategy rooms or council halls, but from a quiet realization spreading through the galaxy that humanity's presence had permanently altered the rules of existence. And this realization produced reactions ranging from cautious admiration to deep-seated fear, because species that had relied on rigid hierarchies and predictable deterrence now faced a civilization that thrived in ambiguity. And Admiral Helen Carter spent long hours reviewing reports that showed a pattern she had anticipated. Smaller powers were accelerating their own militarization not to challenge humanity directly, but to avoid ever being as helpless as the Concord had become, and that arms buildup carried the risk of cascading conflicts, prompting humanity to intervene again not with force, but with structure, proposing shared early warning systems and conflict mediation protocols that reduce incentives for preemptive strikes. And while some species accepted eagerly, others resisted, accusing humans of attempting soft control. Accusations President Laura Bennett addressed openly in a broadcast that acknowledged humanity's power while rejecting the notion of entitlement, stating plainly that humans did not seek obedience but predictability, because unpredictability had nearly ended them all. And those words resonated because they were not polished rhetoric but a blunt admission of vulnerability, something galactic leaders rarely offered. And as trust slowly grew joint exercises began between human forces and former adversaries, revealing just how much of humanity's advantage had come not from superior hardware, but from decentralized decision-making that empowered individuals at every level, a concept alien military struggled to adopt because it required accepting mistakes as part of strength, and Daniel Moore observed these exercises with mixed feelings, aware that sharing knowledge diluted humanity's edge, but also reduced the chance of another catastrophic misunderstanding. And in one notable incident, a coalition patrol detected what appeared to be a human-style deception maneuver near a disputed system, triggering alarm across several governments. Yet instead of mobilizing fleets, they contacted Earth directly, seeking clarification before acting, a simple act that would have been unthinkable before the war. And when the situation was resolved peacefully, it marked a quiet victory, far more meaningful than any battle, and yet shadows remained as isolated groups continued to mythologize humanity as either saviors or monsters, extremes that worried Carter more than open hostility, because myths replaced understanding, and understanding was the only true safeguard. And as the seventh phase near its end, the galaxy stood in a state of uneasy maturity, no longer innocent of human capability, no longer able to pretend that war followed simple patterns. And humanity watched this evolution with guarded hope, knowing that the final test would not be whether others feared them, but whether they learned from what happened. Because the most unfair truth humanity had revealed was that survival favored those willing to change, and change was always painful. The eighth and final phase arrived quietly, without declarations or ceremonies, as the galaxy settled into a new equilibrium shaped by memory rather than fear, and humanity found itself measured not by the wars it could win, but by the future it helped prevent. And President Laura Bennett stood before a joint assembly of human and alien representatives where no banners hung and no anthems played, because symbolism had been stripped away in favor of plain truth. And she spoke about the war not as a triumph, but as a warning, explaining that humanity never fought fair, because fairness assumed shared rules, shared instincts, and shared limits, and the galaxy had none of those in common. When the first shots were threatened, and Admiral Helen Carter later reflected that the greatest human weapon had not been deception or technology, but the refusal to become what the enemy expected, a refusal that forced everyone else to confront their own assumptions, and across former Concord space. Reconstruction continued with human assistance gradually reduced as local systems regained confidence, because humanity understood that lasting peace required stepping back at the right moment, and Daniel Moore returned to civilian research, helping build safeguards that made large-scale deception harder for any species to deploy, accepting that some doors once open had to be closed again, And over time, new generations grew up hearing about the war, not as a story of human domination, but as the moment the galaxy learned caution, restraint, and the cost of arrogance. And in military academies across many worlds, a conflict was studied under a simple title that translated loosely to the danger of certainty. Because the Concord had been certain of human weakness, certain of their own superiority, and certain that war followed rules they understood, and all three certainties had failed. And as years passed and borders stabilized, the phrase humans never fight fair lost its edge as an insult and became a lesson instead. A reminder that adaptability beat tradition, patience beat pride, and understanding beat force, and humanity accepted that reputation without pride, knowing that being underestimated had nearly destroyed them, and being feared could one day do the same. And so they chose a narrow path between the two, walking it with caution learned at great cost. And the galaxy watched, wiser than before, aware that the greatest miscalculation it could ever make again would be assuming it truly understood humanity at all.